practicalities of a just transition. So as you know, this event is a sort of bonus event to a series that the PCC has been hosting on just transitions and energy transitions in particular. And we had an event a few weeks ago on just transition skills and jobs, and there was a lot of interest in the Eskom sort of decommissioning activities happening around Komati. And so we are very grateful to a big Eskom team that have joined us today to talk about some of the challenges that they've been having. And so, yeah, we will have Dr. Oliver will do a few quick introductory remarks from the Presidential Climate Commission perspective. And then we have a team comprised of Noela Molefi, Mzefani, Mzebechana, Dave Lucas, and Beauty Mazabuko sharing with us various components of the activity. Then we'll have a quick response from communities, and then hopefully a really good discussion amongst the audience. I would also like to welcome the team from the Climate 360 event that's also happening today in Mpumalanga, hosted by the EU Climate Diplomacy Week. And so really grateful to have you joining us as well, and we will hopefully be able to get some questions from the team out in Mpumalanga as well. So without much more from myself, I will hand over to Crispian.
Thank you, Steve, and a very good morning, everyone. I'm going to be very brief because, like most of you, I'm here to listen. I think the topic of today is of national interest and is crucial to the future of our country. I mean, as we all know, we have this very large aging coal fleet. Some of these coal-fired power stations are way beyond their economic life, and it's no longer economic to run them. And you know what we're seeing happening with the Komati Power Station is going to be the first in a series of coal-fired power stations that are going to go through a decommissioning process. And, you know, we're all acutely mindful that we can't be decommissioning into a vacuum. So, you know, we've got to be making sure that the grid remains stable and that we've put power onto the system in advance of the decommissioning. And we're also very mindful of the social and economic issues that surround these power stations. So that's partly why the country has adopted this just transition framework. We want to make sure that as we move forward with the climate transition, communities and workers that are directly affected are, we diversify local economies, we tee up the jobs in the new sectors, we put the support and reskilling and social support mechanisms in place to cushion the impact of this decommissioning. And what we're looking at with the Komati project is sort of a test case for how this is going to be done into the future. And it's been really, I think, very exciting to see Eskom try and develop a sort of gold standard decommissioning process, which includes repurposing, which includes making sure that all of the workers involved in the value chains either have jobs elsewhere in Eskom or in a revitalized future green energy hub in Mpumalanga. So with that, just to say it's going to be, I think, a fascinating morning, and I'm really looking forward to the presentations, and like you, will be listening very attentively. So thank you to the Eskom team for being available to do this. It's really great that you're here, and a very warm welcome to everyone else listening in. Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Crispian. I think I might have failed to introduce myself at the beginning. My name's Steve Nichols. I lead the mitigation work and the sort of employment strategy work that we have going at the PCC. And so this is a really important part of that overall thinking that we're doing. So I'm going to hand over to Noella to kind of introduce the context, and then we'll have those series of speakers from Eskom, and then a chance for Q&A at the end. So Noella, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Good morning to everyone. I will just quickly share my screen. Please let me know if you can see it.
Can't see it yet. Perhaps advance the slide and let's see.
Steve, look to you. Please confirm if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it now. Can you hear us okay?
Perfect. I will start then. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Noella Molefe, and I'm a senior advisor for as well as the Just Energy Transition Office. And today's presentation will focus on specific objectives. The first is to recap on all of the key elements of the Eskom Just Energy Transition Strategy. And then we'll look at an overview of the Komati Repowering and Repurposing Program, as well as the socio-economic impact studies, and then we can have a Q&A session. All right, so I'll start with the first slide. So most of, excuse me, just apologies, I cannot see my slides properly. So most of the power stations are nearing the end of life, and with shutting down of power stations, we'll be able to reduce our CO2 emissions, but we'll also be able to create jobs and repower. So if we look at our current situation, we can see that in 2022, we have one coal plant that's beyond its coal life, beyond its end of its life, and that's Komati Power Station. The generation capacity that is going to go offline is currently less than 1 gigawatt. And the jobs at risk, if we do not have any interventions in place, are zero. And the total carbon emissions are sitting at 232 megatons of CO2 equivalent. So for 2035, we put together a Eskom board-approved 2035 strategy. And as part of the strategy, we are looking at shutting down 9 power stations. And we're also looking at the capacity of 15 gigawatts going offline. However, if we don't do anything, the jobs at risk would be sitting at 55,000 with no interventions, and the total carbon emissions will be at 143 megatons of CO2 equivalent. This is almost half of what we are sitting at right now. But for 2050, the plan is to add an additional 3 power stations to be shut down. So we have a total of 12 power stations. However, the generation capacity that is going to be going offline is 29 gigawatts. And then if we look at the jobs, we'll have 102,000 jobs at risk if we do not have any interventions put in place. The total carbon emissions we're looking at is at a reduction of 55 megatons of CO2 equivalent. What's very important to know is that the Eskom aging plants are currently also non-compliant with the South African minimum emissions standards. So this means that if we had to shut down our power plants and be compliant to the MES standards, we would lose immediately 16 gigawatts of capacity, which would be a severe problem. What we're trying to do now is to table with the DFFE that we can please introduce or implement the Just Energy Transition Strategy, where we shut down coal plants and reduce emissions, and at the same time create jobs as well as protect the environment, instead of retrofitting our power stations with ambient technologies, which would cost quite a lot. We're looking at 300 billion rands to implement these technologies. before I go on to the next slide, Steve, are you able to see the full slides?
Yes, we can see them fine. Thank you.
All right, you're not seeing my face there as well. Okay. Okay, let me continue. So there are definitely legitimate concerns with regards to the coal value chain. And this is not something that we plan to disregard. You know, I think it's something that we really need to take into consideration. Looking at the unemployment rates, if we look at South Africa, the average unemployment rates are sitting at 34%. For Mpumalanga, it's at 36%, and for the women, 39%, and youth, 48%. So the unemployment rates in Mpumalanga are much higher than the national rates, and even more higher for the vulnerable groups, being the women and the youth. If we look at the environmental impacts of the coal value chain, we have over 29,000 premature deaths in South Africa every year, and these are caused by the ambient or the household air pollution. And this air pollution is driven in part by energy poverty, coal beneficiation, as well as our coal power plants. There's also a lot of open cast mining, and this is very poorly regulated mining, and most of the time it's usually illegal. Our coal ash dams are also contaminating the air as well as the groundwater. Our power stations. We're also looking at damage to infrastructure. This is now when we are transporting the coal from the mines to our power stations. There are opportunities to damage or challenges where we damage our road infrastructure when this is taking place. So Mpumalanga is very well endowed with a lot of resources and can easily become the energy hub for the energy transition, and is more likely to transition more quickly than any other place in the country. If you look at the resources, this image here, you can see that most of the solar and wind resources are concentrated in the northern and the western parts of the country. However, for Mpumalanga, the resources are quite good as well as compared to other places in the world. What Mpumalanga has is grid access. Most of the power stations are situated in Mpumalanga, and therefore we have the grid that is already readily available to connect the renewable energy. So that is one positive aspect for Mpumalanga, as well as the people. We've just reflected on the unemployment rates, and there are approximately 200,000 people that can be trained or reskilled to work in the renewable energy sector. So Eskom is also looking to unlock investment opportunities. We've recently leased our land. We have Eskom and has the potential for 7 gigawatts of capacity to be generated. We recently leased our land to 4 independent power producers, and they will be occupying around 6,000 hectares of land. And the plan is for them to generate at least 2 gigawatts of electricity and add to the grid. We're also looking at strategic infrastructure investments, and this is where Eskom can make investments to unlock about 17 gigawatts of grid capacity by 2027. And this is your transformers, power substations, etc. And then if we move on to the coal stations repowering and repurposing, this is the project that we're working on, where we plan to repower and repurpose our power stations, starting with Komati Power Station. Lastly, we're looking at virtual wheeling agreements, and this is something we're working with Vodacom. It is something that is still in the process, but the aim is for Eskom to offer virtual wheeling agreements to link renewable producers to end users. So this image here is basically our 2050 net zero world, or our vision that we aim for, where we have demand side response, where the distribution grid is more flexible, and we also have firm capacity of approximately 115 gigawatts of wind and PV constructed. We have seasonal peaking power, where we have gas, using gas as a transitional peaking fuel, and daily peaking power of approximately 25 gigawatts of batteries, as well as pump storage for short-term storage. And then trade. This is where we'll be able to trade our resources without actually looking at the different border taxes as well. We'll be not affected significantly by the carbon border taxes. If we move to our industry, we want our industry and commerce to grow with access to reliable and abundant as well as affordable power. And our old power stations would then be, the nuclear as well as the coal plants would be maintained until they are replaced and ultimately phased out. Our overall goal for Eskom, for the country, is to reignite the renewable energy sector in Mpumalanga, and we play on the word where we plan to repower with 7 gigawatts of firm capacity, 50 gigawatts of renewable capacity, and approximately 10 gigawatts of storage. We plan to repurpose using existing facilities to create new industries, looking at the microgrid assemblies and agrivoltaics. We plan to reskill. This is where we're looking at establishing the training facility at Komati Power Station. The plan is to also re-empower, where we look at 280,000 net jobs to be created and 25,000 jobs to 72,000 jobs to be created in Mpumalanga. And lastly, to reduce our emissions to approximately 143 megatons of CO2 equivalents by 2035, as well as to reduce our water consumption by 40 billion liters by 2050. So in total, we'll require about 1.2 trillion rands in investments for us to implement the Just Energy Transition Strategy. And this is for the country. It's not specifically for a power station. And this also focuses on different aspects: generation, transmission, and distribution. Where we have generation, we would like to have firm capacity, variable capacity, and storage capacity. And this would be at an estimated cost of 990 billion rands. For transmission, we need to expand and strengthen our transmission network. We need to build approximately 8,000 kilometers of new line and 101 substations. And this will cost 130 billion rands. And then we have the distribution capacity, where we strengthen the distribution network for embedded generation and build approximately 7,500 kilometers of line. And this would cost approximately 56 billion rands. So I'll stop there and hand over to my colleague, Mzifani, to continue.
Thanks, Noella. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, thank you. So here, the focus is specifically at Komati as requested. The speaker, Crispian, mentioned the stations that are old. So Komati is following on that category as well. It's one of the old power stations. It was fully commissioned in 1966. Between 1987 and 1990, the station was mothballed. But later on, it was returned to service around 2004. Currently, we've got one unit that is in operation. It's unit 9, and is a unit that is going to be now shut down by the end of this month. So after then, all the unit will be out. So the plan, basically considering the age of the station as well, currently that the station is inefficient, is now taking the advantage of that and repurpose this power station. And Komati, has already been mentioned, will be our first station. And the plan is to learn from this and be able then to use it as a prototype or a case, proof of concept for the rest of the stations that will be shut down and repurposed. Next slide, please. Basically, here we're just showing the Komati, the site, the one picture is just showing the different areas where we've got land that can be used for the different technologies, but also more focusing on the far right, focusing on the different, what is the scope, the overview of the project overall, the program. So we're going to have decommissioning. We're going to talk that in detail in the next slide. We've got the decommissioning portion. We've got the repowering initiatives where we've got the solar PV. Sorry, can you remain on the same slide? Where we've got solar PV, we've got 100 megawatt solar PV. Sorry, previous slide, Noel. We've got 100 megawatt solar PV and possibly 50 megawatt as well after the rehabilitation. And then we've got the battery energy storage, which is 600 megawatt hour. We've looked at the gas option. We've done our internal studies, but also the consultant that we are working with did look at the option of the gas inland. It came not viable. We also went to test the market to see if it's viable. Currently, the gas seems not viable for inland. One of the major challenges with gas inland is the 20% drop. So basically, the gas is more inefficient inland compared to coast because of the altitude effect. So currently, gas is not a viable option. We've looked at the biomass. Also, currently is not viable both financially and also the actual source of the fuel that we need is currently problematic. We've looked at wind, and wind is possible. We are saying currently we've got a possibility up to 70 megawatt of wind. We'll talk about this on the next slide as well. And then the other technology, which is more to provide a system support on the transmission side, is to convert the existing generators to be what is called synchronous condensers to provide support on the grid. That is going to become very important as we get more renewables into the system. Over and above that, we are planning for Komati specifically to have microgrid assembly as well as agrivoltaics. Those initiatives also are in progress. Actually, those are more advanced. We're already finalizing the appointment of the contractor for the agrivoltaics and microgrid, and there's some work already started there as part of the assembly. But also there's a training facility that we will be requiring for skilling and reskilling. And Noella has touched on this already. I think Beauty is going to touch as well on it. And also as part of this, then we're going to have some farming that is going to come up as part of the agrivoltaics. Next slide, please. Basically, if you are looking how we've designed the Komati, we've got three components. We've got the component, we call it component A, which is decommissioning, component B is repowering, and component C is opportunities for workers and communities. This is the design that we've done working with the funder, the World Bank as well. So on the component A, the decommissioning, we're expecting this work, we're expecting that is going to take up to 5 years. We will need to work closely with owners, engineers, and in terms of contract, we'll be following EPC. So that is very important as part of the transitioning. Although we're not going to do full decommissioning, but we still need some decommissioning required to be done. We'll just talk that to the next slide a little bit. Then the next component B, the one is focusing on the actual technologies. So it's split into two phases. Phase one, we are able to continue with the work while we are doing the actual decommissioning and doing the rehabilitation, creating more space for further work to be done, especially on the STEM and other areas, but also inside the buildings that will remain that I will touch on in the next slide. Component C is support for permanent workers, contract workers, and suppliers. Development of agrivoltaics, microgrid assembly facility, and commodity training facility as part of the repurposing and establishing of Eskom JET task force to drive stakeholder engagement and community empowerment. my colleague Beauty is going to expand on this. Next slide, please. So basically, in terms of the decommissioning, what we mean by decommissioning, we will be shutting down the station, we're doing some demolition and rehabilitation, specifically on the area where we've got the current plant. As I've mentioned already, this is a 4 to 5 years. What is critical now that we are driving, we are busy, is to appoint the owner's engineer for us to be able to move further with this. We will need owner's engineer. Currently, our internal engineers are helping to start putting some work together, especially because we are already running with the environmental and social impact assessment. So they are providing input. But for more detailed specifications that will be required to go to the market, the owner's engineer will come and provide supervision. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
So funny, just quickly, there seems to be some of the audience that can't hear you too well, that there's an echo. So perhaps if you could speak maybe a bit slower and into the more into the mic, that might help them.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, sorry, I'm in the offices, so I try to get a spot where I could sit where it's a bit quiet. So okay. in terms of the decommissioning, so basically, if you see what is shown here, we've got the plant where there's the current plant where we're going to be doing some demolition of some structures, but also there are SDMs where we'll need to be rehabilitated. But there are also areas where we are able to continue doing some repurposing as part of the component B, of which I'm going to touch on. So while we are doing decommissioning, we are able at the same time starting introducing the new technologies. Next slide, please. This is just further showing closely what we are demolishing, taking out, and also what is going to remain. In terms of all the yellow buildings, it's mainly the temporal buildings. So we're gonna reuse or sell, depending after when we're doing the final work. The green buildings and plant is what we're gonna retain. That will be required to become important as part of the repurposed site. Especially, we need the transmission yard to the substation. That is gonna be very important as we're going into the future, because that's where we're gonna connect to the new technologies, but also the turbine hall is going to be used for the central condensers that we've mentioned. Other structures, we're going to be basically removing and doing the rehabilitation. That is going to help in the future also create more space for the technologies where there's a need. Next slide, please. This is just showing now just in different colors, but it's still emphasizing, showing what is going to be, what's going to remain as part of the site. Especially, I think the green part is the one we're going to keep. The other sections is what's going to be demolished and then rehabilitated. And then we're going to have more space into the future for the new technologies. Next slide, please. It's a bit slow on my side. This is showing more the SDM areas of which we're going to be installing the solar PVs and somewhere close by, maybe have some possibility of having wind, but those will need more work, as we're going to touch on it later on as well. Next slide. So this is component B, where we are saying basically we are putting the new technology, our solar PV, our wind and batteries. Why do we need this? This is very important for us as we transition, that we have this mix. I think what is important here is the technologies that we are introducing. As we said, at least 100 megawatt solar up to 70 megawatt of wind, and there's 150 megawatt of battery. That is not replacing the coal. It's basically allowing us, when we're shutting down the plant, to have some new technologies around the area. So if we compare the size and what will be taken out and what is going to remain, is way less than the size, but taking the advantage of the site is very important. So we're going to go with that hybrid, but also include the synchronous condensers, as we mentioned, that are very important as part of the providing the grid into the system as we go into the future. So the repurposing is going to be done in 2 phases. I've mentioned we've got space that is already available for us to continue, as shown on this slide, where we'll be able to start introducing the technologies while we are doing the demolition. So as we said, the actual sizes of the different technologies will be firmed up as part of the detailed engineering. Currently, we're just estimating 100 megawatts and up to 70 in terms of wind, but the final sizes we want to firm up as part of the owner's engineer that we're going to appoint. That is going to firm up that, and then we are able to have the final sizes for it. So maybe I want to emphasize that at this stage. Next slide, please. The other part, while is turning, it's more on the Eskom side, where we're going to have additional 50 megawatt of solar PV and approximately 20 megawatt of wind. That is going to be introduced around the solar will be on top of the rehabilitated Eskom, and around the final position of the actual wind will be somewhere close by, that will be firmed up by the owner's engineer, but also on the turbine house. Then that's where we'll do the final 2 synchronous condensers. The first one we'll do it as part of phase 1. We'll learn from it, and then the last 2 will be done as part of phase 2. I think that's the last slide. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. I'm going to take over and just give some more insight into the socio-economic impact assessments. My name is Dave Lucas, and I'm a corporate specialist in Eskom in terms of environmental management. And I think Noella and Zafani have given great context. And when one looks at the number of coal-fired power stations that are to be shut down, and the work that has been done at Komati Power Station already, all of this has been based on undertaking socio-economic impact assessments. And it clearly, when one looks at the just energy transition means that shutting down of coal-fired power stations will have an impact on workers, both workers within Eskom, those that are contracted in, and also then it has an impact on communities that are dependent in terms of one way or another their livelihoods of these power stations. And clearly all of this then has an impact on the economy, both at a local area, but also within a broader context within Mpumalanga. And therefore, when one looks at the just energy transition, to be just, one has to ensure that one looks at how do you stabilize the local economy going forward? How do you develop skills, reskill, develop new skills in terms of the way forward? How does one strengthen what is in place and what needs to be strengthened in those communities in which these power stations are located? And then communication and stakeholder engagement is critical to ensure that the process of migration is just. And lastly, the initiatives that are put in place, and Msafani shared some of those initiatives being done at Komati Power Station. How do you ensure that they are sustainable? How do you ensure you get growth that takes place in terms of the mitigation, that the mitigation doesn't just last for a year or 2 or 3, but it actually is sustainable mitigation options that you put in place. So if we move to the next slide, you'll get a bit of an insight into the socio-economic assessments that are being undertaken and have been completed within Eskom. So if we look at the shutting down of power stations, and you can see on the left-hand side, the power stations and the years in which these power stations are planned to shut down. And you will see that this takes us from now, 2022, all the way up, getting up to close to 2050, with 9 power stations shutting down by 2035. And so we've already done socio-economic impacts through urban econs, and that was done at Komati, Hendrina, as well as Grootfontein Power Station. And you'll find in our next speaker, Beauty, will talk in some detail around the work that was done at Komati through those socio-economic assessments, but also through the World Bank funding and the consultants, VBC, that have undertaken not only socio-economic assessment, but also technical, environmental, as well as economic assessments. But they've done social assessments also on Komati, Hendrina, Camden and Grootfontein, but not to the same level in terms of the socio-economic assessments as that done by Urban Econ. And that's why it's not a duplication of work, but it's going to the next level of detail. And we are currently about 60% the way through socio-economic assessment through the NDC partnership. And we've got a consortium of consultants doing a socio-economic assessment for Camden and Arnott, Creel, Tutuka, Matla, Duva, and even for Kendall Power Station. Just moving to the next slide, you'll see the framework in which these socio-economic assessments are done. So if we start off by looking at the first work by Urban Econ, you will see that their purpose is really to identify the risk and put in mitigation to deal with the shutting down of Komati, Hendrina and Grootfontein, and really then create mitigation that really is ensured that the sustainable livelihoods of those that are affected can continue. So the objective of this study has been identify and assess the impact, determine the risks, and identify opportunities in terms of the mitigation, and then putting in sustainable mitigation plans. And Beauty will talk in some detail around Komati on this. The next one is on the World Bank studies. If we move to the next slide, you'll see on the World Bank studies also quite similar. I think there's just a hold in terms of moving to the next slide. I think there's a bit of a delay. There we go. Also quite similar, the World Bank studies also to develop a preliminary socioeconomic analysis. And that's why we're doing these other social assessments, socioeconomic assessments as well. And it's really to identify what is the baseline conditions of shutting those stations down. And then what is also the impact of these 4 power stations. Again, the objectives of these socioeconomic assessments is to understand the stakeholder analysis, determine what the baseline study is of shutting down, assess the labor issues and the staff requirements, workshop in terms of getting alternatives, how can this be mitigated, and then putting a proposal of how to proceed. The next slide just covers the work that's currently in progress through the NDC partnership, and this is through a consortium through Genesis Analytics. Also identify the risks, identify the opportunities, identify the impacts of shutting down of 7 coal-fired power stations. They take us all the way up until 2044, and really to create mitigation of how we can deal with the impacts that come out of the shutting down of the stations. And really the objective of this study has been determine the status quo, what is the assessment of just shutting down, and then looking more importantly at the mitigation. How can we mitigate the socioeconomic impacts through repowering, repurposing, and then other plans, and putting an implementation plan. The next slide then just talks about the general approach that is being taken for all of these socioeconomic assessment. It's really about doing the baseline assessment, the worst case. What is the impact when you shut down the power station with no mitigation? Then you start looking at the mitigation. And for us, it's important to look at, firstly, the repowering options, the solar, the wind, the battery, and other technologies to actually produce megawatts at those sites. So to identify repowering options that can be placed on these sites. And then looking at repurposing options. How can we repurpose these sites that will develop jobs, that will develop industries, and linking these repurposing options to the repowering options. So if we know we're going to be building lots of solar plants, lots of PV solar installations, wind facilities, battery storage, how can we optimize on repurposing these sites to actually be part of the value chain of those repowering technologies, and then to look at alternative technologies that could be done at these sites. Could be ash beneficiation, it could be agricultural activities and others. But I think we do understand that even with all these repowering and repurposing, we're not going to be able to fully mitigate the megawatts that were produced at these sites, but that is the role of the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy in terms of the integrated resource plan. But our approach is to look at how can we repower and repurpose those sites through the socio-economic assessments that are being undertaken. So I think just moving on to that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Beauty, and Beauty will take you through some of the detail of the socio-economic assessment that has been done at Komati Power Station. Beauty, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Itima Zibugo. I'm with Eskom Risk and Sustainability Division. Excuse me, I currently have load shedding, so my video is not so clear. And I'm also going to just request that I will present without the video just to save on bandwidth. Thanks, my colleagues have taken you through the introduction, the JET strategy, and also Dave has just gone into the socio-economic impact assessment study. The focus of my section of the presentation is going to be on the socio-economic impact assessment study for the shutdown of Komati Power Station. So the snapshot of the socio-economic environment, Noella referred to earlier in terms of generally the Mpumalanga. We know the socio-economic environment of our country. We've got structural and systemic issues in terms of challenges in unemployment, challenges of poverty, and also challenges in terms of inequality. Specifically referring to Mpumalanga, Mpumalanga's economy is very reliant on the coal value chain. There's a concentration of mines, coal mines in Mpumalanga. There's also then we have the concentration of the power stations, because of course the power stations are located close to the mines. And the coal accounts for about 35% of the gross value add for Steve Tshwete local municipality, which is where Komati Power Station is located. You'll see on the right-hand side, there's a map there that shows the Komati Power Station. It's a zoomed-in map, so you see the power station, and then you also see there is an informal settlement. It's called Big House, that's very close to the power station. And then you also have Blinkpan Village and Blinkpan. That's a mining area. So there was a mine in Blinkpan, and a Blinkpan mine, and then we also have Kudehoop colliery that's also in that area. Next to the power station is also the accommodation built by Eskom called Komati Village. I just want to say in terms of locality as well, feeder areas to Komati Power Station are Wheatbank, Emalahleni, Middleburg, and also Belfast is not too far away from Komati Power Station. Those are the main feeder areas. Also, on top of that, what we look at when we do the impact assessment study is that the area around Komati Power Station has actually had a decline in mining in the past 10 years. So that's one of the socio-economic dynamics of the area. There's been a lot of mines that have closed down in the past 10 years, which really affected the economy of the area. So the shutdown of the power station is really almost like a tipping point of a series of economic activities that have been happening around the Komati Power Station. We also know that the nearest colliery that we were using to supply the power station, called Kroonfontein Mine, also went into business rescue and was closed in 2018. So that's been one of the dynamics. As of now, Komati Power Station is trucking coal to the power station. I then want to go on to in terms of the socio-economic dynamics. In 2011, because we're using 2011 data, there were about 4,000 people in the Komati area, in the primary study area. So we are looking at a population of less than 5,000 based on the statistics. Noela, if you can go back to the previous slide. So there are those challenges. It's a very young population as well that is in the area around Komati Power Station. So there's a lot of young people. The area is also challenged in terms of social ills, drug and alcohol abuse, and also health-related challenges. Most of the people in the area have actually been in the area for quite a while, at least 16 years. One thing we also noticed is that as the mines were shutting down, closing, some of the community members moved into the Komati village area actually and bought property there and settled there. So in terms of vulnerability, we do have, there's farming communities next to Komati Power Station. We view those as vulnerable, the youth, the women, and there's some returned mine workers. We can go to the next slide, thanks. So the impact assessment, we looked at impact on people, the economy and the environment. So in terms of the economy, we looked at the local, regional and national context. So if you see the economic metrics that we looked at the impact on the local area. We looked at Steve Twitter local municipality, impact on Mpumalanga as the region, and also impact on South Africa. So looking at the employment skills, the community sustainability, business impacts really in terms of the value chain, of the suppliers to the power station, government revenue in terms of tax, and also property. People, it's quality of life, migration patterns are quite important, and the living conditions and also access to services, being one of the structural challenges in South Africa. We looked at that as well, and income levels. In the environment, we looked at the land use and the quality of the environment. Next slide, please. The assessment is done using what is called a capitals framework. So we used at the social and economic, looked at the social and economic impacts, looking at the aspect of community development. So how that is affected irrespective, looking at the different capitals. So we looked at your natural capital, human capital, your built capital, really in terms of what's going to happen to the infrastructure thereof, and cultural and social capital is quite important as well in terms of, how people organize themselves and also leadership. And political capital we also looked at, it's important in terms of, the sense of inclusion and power dynamics. And then we also looked at the financial and economic capital. What's important is that these capitals are not mutually exclusive. They do, affect each other. So it's when we looked at the assessment, we made sure that we look at the linkages as well and interrelationships between the different capitals. Next slide, please. So in terms of the data collection, there was a lot of data that was collected. So there were community surveys that were done. For community meetings were held. We had meetings, with what councillors, what committee, and, focus group meetings. The study actually started in 2020. So it was, when we just started just January in 2020, and then 3 months later, we went into lockdown. So there's a bit of a challenge in terms of, the data collection and also the stakeholder engagement. But we worked around the different levels of lockdown. And so as the levels of lockdown went to level 3, we were then able to go to the field and the field work could be done. There were employee household surveys that were done to about 80 households in the Komati village, which has about 1,200 households. And then there were also business and social facility surveys that were done. Local businesses were looked at, but over and above the local businesses, there was a survey that was done on the supply chain. So we looked at the different levels of suppliers, so your large, medium, and small suppliers, just to really understand how the dependence of the suppliers on the power station and how they would be affected by the shutdown of the power station. Next slide, please. So in terms of the supply chain for the financial year 2020, 1.6 billion, the power stations was spent at the power station. And of those, due to the procurement policies of Eskom to really ensure that we buy from the local area as much as possible, 70% of that was spent in Mpumalanga. And then 30% of that was in the rest of the country. So Gauteng and even as far as Western Cape, depending on where the services are being sourced. There were no goods and services procured from the primary study area, probably because of capacity and capability. But it is something that's noted and something that really, as part of the mitigation measures, is one of the things that we looked at. Of that spend of 1.6 billion, 51% went into mining, and that is really the coal supply. So our coal supply to the power station. 33% went into trade, and then government services, 4%, and then 4% on financial and business services, and 3% into construction. I don't have a separate slide that talks into the coal, but I do want to say that with the one unit, the power station is now tracking about 45 trucks of coal per day to the power station, and we have looked into the whole coal value chain in terms of the supply and the logistics. So what happened, because the coal is being trucked, we've looked at the impacts along the way, and we've also with the closure of Kroonfontein mine, we had to divert existing coal agreements to the power station. So there is no coal supply contracts that would be affected by the shutdown of Komati Power Station, because the coal is being really diverted from existing contracts. So those contracts will continue. We know there will still be an impact, but in terms of contractually, there will be no contracts that will be affected. The power station also supplies water. There's a water treatment facility at the power station that is used really for the coal generation, but we for the electricity generation, but we then also use that water is then supplied to Komati village, and it's also supplied to the Lakama group, so about 1.5 milliliters a month, and the Kroonfontein mine. We still supply Kroonfontein mine, though it is closed. I believe it's for maintenance purposes, and they are in the process of, the mine has been bought by another company, Black Opal, so I believe it will be operational soon. The power station also owns 2 properties in Komati village. Next slide, please. So maybe just to add on the previous slide in terms of the properties, with the power station having been mothballed for about 19 years, a lot of the workers at the power station actually ended up moving. The permanent workers now don't stay in Komati village. That is why there's only 2 properties. The properties have been sold, so they're privately owned. And the power station only owns 2. So you'll see that is also reflected in this dynamics of the slide. The total number of employees in 2020 at Komati Power Station, there were about 810 employees. Of that is divided into 3 categories. There's Eskom permanent workers, there's ERI employees and contract workers. There are about 276 Eskom permanent workers, and then ERI employees, there are about 231 and 303 contractors. Majority of the Eskom permanent workers are actually, it's a young population. They are below 45 years of age, which means that really is young, productive, experienced, and flexible and adaptable employees that actually have a sense of mobility as well. Many of the skills of the permanent employees are actually technicians, engineers, and operators. And those skills are actually reusable along the clean energy chain as well. So if you have your technicians and engineers and operators, they can actually be skilled and reskilled and upskilled to work in the clean energy space. ERI employees, so ERI does a lot of the coal and ash handling, and also they do some of the maintenance work. So most of the workers in ERI bracket are operators, utility men, and there's also general workers and artisans. The ERI permanent employees can be transferred to other sites or operations to be relocated there. In terms of the contractors, the 190 actually of the 300 contractors will remain on site because they'll still be work on site in terms of maintenance work. And then alternatives are being looked at in terms of engaging the contractors for the other contract workers. You will see also on the support that is offered to the contract workers. Thanks. Next slide. So one of the important aspects of this has been the stakeholder engagement. We've done a lot of stakeholder engagement, very extensive to make sure that there's community involvement, empowerment through a collective and participatory approach. So we've had engagements right from national, provincial and local government, but we've also had extensive engagement in the area in Komati. As I explained earlier, there's been many meetings with the community, meetings with the community representatives. There's also been many meetings with the ward committees and ward councillors, just to take them through what the shutdown of the power station means, and also explain and get their views and inputs on how they view and see themselves in the repowering and repurposing space. I must say that for the engagements for Eskom, was very, very difficult conversations, particularly with the district, local and district municipalities, until we had the repowering and repurposing options. It was very, very difficult to talk about the power station shutting down without an alternative. The repowering and repurposing actually offered a way to be able to have conversations around, the at least economic activity continuing in the area. Partnerships I've indicated at the bottom, but the next slide will actually talk to specific partnerships that have already been developed. But we view all the stakeholders there as potential partners. We have an MOU that has been established with between Eskom and the Mpumalanga provincial government for collaborating in a just transition in the project. So we're looking at just transition and your green economy types of projects. So that's a very, very key milestone for both Eskom and Mpumalanga to be able to work together, because we know that the number of power stations Eskom has in Mpumalanga. We've also had extensive and our continuing engagement and partnership and collaboration with the World Bank Group, which are, will be funding the repowering of Komati Power Station and all, but that excludes the training facility. So we've really been engaging with the World Bank. They've developed a whole project. It's called the Komati EJP. So the Komati Just Energy Transition Project. I will share links to the documents from the World Bank on this project, and then which is what we're discussing today. And then there's funding for the Komati training facility is actually provided by GEAP. It is grant funding by the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. And then we do have a partnership with Saratech for the Komati training facility. assisting in Eskom Academy of Learning to receive its accreditation and enabling Eskom to
Have we lost Beauty, or is it just me?
I think we've lost her.
Yeah. I think we've lost her for the moment.
The great irony, of course, is Eskom speakers being disrupted by Eskom load shedding. Noella, are you able to get hold of Beauty maybe via phone and just see if she's can dial back in?
Will do.
Thank you. Sorry, audience, if you wouldn't mind holding on just for a few seconds while we get Beauty back.
Steve, what we can perhaps do, just in the interest of time, is I can just continue while we get Beauty back on the call. I just want to check. There we go. I'll just continue and then we'll pick up as Beauty comes back.
So great. Thank you.
Great. So I'll just put my camera back on. Yeah, so I think just it's Dave Lucas again speaking, and being involved in the socioeconomic impact assessments, clearly one of the issues, a key part has been the stakeholder engagement that Beauty spoke about. And when one looks at some of the issues raised by stakeholders, and you can see the key things coming out and the concerns that stakeholders have: loss of income, loss of business revenue, local skills deficit, access to water, other issues from a social nature, the substance abuse, and what happens when one starts getting loss of jobs, loss of income, you start incurring other social ills at the same place. And I think those have been important for us to be aware of when doing these socioeconomic impact assessments. So just moving to the next slide, we talk about the process that was followed in terms of the work done at Komati in terms of the socioeconomic assessment. And really it was starting with, so what is a baseline scenario? If there's no mitigation, if you just shut down the power station and walk away, what are the impacts? And we know from these studies that the financial and economic impact, the built capital that it has, the human capital impact that it has, the social and cultural capacity in terms of the loss of place, the family ties that are broken, and then from all of those, there are cumulative impacts, the standard of living declines, the quality of life drops, etc. And we're also obviously aware that with shutting down the power stations, there is the stopping of the emissions from these power stations. There's an increase in water availability that these power stations would have used. So there are some positive environmental impacts, aspects from it, but collectively massive socioeconomic impacts of just shutting down. And therefore, there is an absolute need to identify what are the opportunities, how do we mitigate that? So if we do move to the next slide, it really talks about the 5 areas that I spoke about earlier. We need to stabilize the local economy. We need to put in mitigation that develops the skills and upskilling and development of jobs within those areas. We need to strengthen the communities by identifying what are the existing gaps, what are the challenges that communities have, and a lot of this comes through the stakeholder engagement. And then the whole stakeholder engagement process is important as part of the mitigation strategy. And lastly, as I indicated as well, we need to grow. We need to ensure that these mitigation measures are sustainable and that they don't collapse after a certain period of time. They need to actually grow and develop and become part of the new economy of those areas. So I think just looking at some of the mitigation, and they were grouped into 3 phases in terms of implementation, in terms of sort of incremental changes that can happen, some quick wins, and then some permanent mitigation that can take place. And I think just looking at the quick wins, in terms of what Mzafani presented on, are some of the projects being undertaken. There are some that are undertaken by Eskom, but we've also identified that there are opportunities that can take place at Komati Power Station area over and above what Eskom can be involved in, but what the opportunities for the community to be involved in could be: alien vegetation removal and beneficiation, crop farming, etc. as well. But I think we've seen some of these projects that Mzafani spoke about. I think if we look at the opportunities for workers and objectives, it really is about the transitional support that needs to be provided both to the permanent workers at the power station, but also those that are suppliers and contract workers. We need to look at the community development and the economic sort of growth and expansion within those areas through the repowering and repurposing activities. If we just move on to the...
Thanks, Dave.
You're back on. Thanks, Beauty. I'll hand back to
Please, if
yourself.
we can go to the previous slide. So really, thanks, Dave. So it's about really mitigating and minimizing the impact. So I always think about it: minimize, mitigate, and manage the impacts, and address the impacts also during the transition itself as well, and ensure that there is support for the community and the workers. So the project with the World Bank has been divided into three in terms of this opportunities for workers and communities. It's transition support for the Komati workers, suppliers and contract workers, and then also community development and economic diversification, which is important, and the stakeholder engagement element, 3 parts. Thanks. Next slide. So in terms of transition support for the permanent workers, suppliers, and contract workers, workforce transition for Eskom and ERI employees, there are levers that has been put in place. There is an HR plan that's been developed, and currently it's under consultation. Really, we need to go through consultations with the labor, and we also need to consult with the staff as well. So we are going through that process of consultations with the labor, which is quite important. I think it's been taken through the consultative forum, and now it's going through to the generation forum as well, and then it's consulted on at the BU forum at local level. In terms of labor consultations as well, in the Komati repowering and repurposing project, and the shutdown is actually consulted on at network level as well. So the levers that have been put in place are transfers of the workers to other power stations, reskilling and upskilling to be deployed in the repurposed renewable energy plant, so in the clean energy space, and then secondments to other Eskom operations or projects. So those are the 3 levers that are being looked at. And as it were now, employees have actually, some of them have voluntarily looked for opportunities in other power stations. But I must say as well that about 150 of the current employees now, the 190 was the contractors, 150 of the current employees will actually be remaining on site for maintenance and other purposes. Support to suppliers and contract workers is the localization. It's quite key in terms of local contact to ensure that there are opportunities. And then supply development for decommissioning and repurposing. This is going to be based on the localization strategy. So with the localization strategy that's being developed, there's going to be accompanied by supply development to ensure that really the opportunities can be afforded or afforded to suppliers and contractors, though they will have to bid through the normal process, and then support to local suppliers with a focus on development contributions and shareholding by local communities. It's very important that local suppliers from Mpumalanga actually can get opportunities from this repowering and repurposing. And then there needs to be linkage with the existing social assistance and active labor market policies. That's quite an important aspect to the social assistance part. Training, the third one is the Komati training facility for skilling and upskilling of the workers. But we're saying it's not just the workers, it's also other power stations, neighboring power stations. And we know as well that, there's renewable energy projects that will be in Mpumalanga. So we really believe that upskilling and skilling of the local community that is, qualifies would be important as well for them to get opportunities. Next slide, please. So yes, in terms of the community development and economic diversification, the agrivoltaics and microgrid, there are projects that will be scaled up to other power stations. So they're not just for Komati only. The same with the concept of the training facility as well. And then the community-driven development and livelihood support, which is quite important. We looking at investment in the local area, livelihood and enterprise development, which is important in terms of people being able to sustain themselves in terms of livelihoods. And we know that there's a growth in terms of the small and medium enterprises really running the economy. So it's important that there's enterprise development, and then the skilling and upskilling of the community members and community support. And the community support is really to address those gaps that have been identified in terms of the socio-economic dynamics of the local communities. Thanks. Next slide, please. This is just a picture because we talk a lot about microgrids. The picture here is just to demonstrate what the microgrid looks like. So what it is really a container that has solar panels. So you can see on the left-hand side is the solar PV modules that sit on top of the container. The container really in terms of cost is about 1.5 million rand. But with that microgrid container, you are able to, we have a project in Vicksburg, it can power about 20 homes. And then at the bottom, it's showing the workshops. These are not necessarily from Komati Power Station, but these are the workshops really where the containerized microgrids will be assembled, because we are looking at an assembly plant for the microgrids. The business case has been done to say that this will be used to actually to afford electricity to unelectrified parts of the country. And also, secondly, the model that's being used is that distribution, Eskom distribution will be the entity that will be used to supply the electricity to the unelectrified parts of the country. Next slide, please. This one is showing the agrivoltaics. This one is showing the agrivoltaics, which is used for aquaponics, would be used for aquaponics farming, and the mushroom dome. So with this one, the agrivoltaics, the good thing about it is that it actually offers opportunities to train the local community in terms of farming, also train them also in the mushroom business. And thirdly, that element, there will also be jobs that are linked to that. So it's jobs, training, as well as enterprises that will be developed. Thanks. Next slide. This is a slide that is showing the signing ceremony for Komati training facility, both at CPUT, so at Saratech, and also at the Komati Power Station. And there, the right-hand side is the logo of the Komati training facility. Next slide, please. This is the projects for economic diversification. I won't go much into it because of time, but we are looking at community driven models as well. And an important one is that at the bottom, to address, our infrastructure, basic services, and other structural challenges, we do believe that there's a need to work with the government to address some of the basic services as well. At the next slide, please. What will be the impact or the value created by the Komati repowering and repurposing? There'll be about 430 full-time employee jobs. So those are the net direct jobs. And then there'll be about 7,700 temporary jobs during the construction phase, because there's a lot of jobs that are created during construction and decommissioning. And then we are looking at, the 370 megawatts generation capacity added. And comparing it to the one unit that's offering 100 megawatts at the moment. And then there'll be about 200 people trained at the Komati training facility. The total cost of the project, potential funding from the World Bank, is about 490 million US dollars, which translates to about 7.89 billion rands. Next slide, please. I believe that's my last slide. So in conclusion, social dialogue is quite important for the transition, which is why, being here is such a privilege to be able to share this information and engage. We've mapped out in terms of where Eskom should be engaging, right from including structures like your NBI, BUSA, and also, of course, at so the provincial level as well. We strongly believe that there's need for the dialogue to continue. And then the impact of the closure of the power station are quite significant, but and will affect the economy and lives, but it offers an opportunity to actually build and rebuild the economy and rebuild actually for Eskom's reputation as well. Yes, the repowering and repurposing make a significant contribution. Achieving the above requires not just Eskom, but we also believe that we have to work with government. Actually, there is a slide that has been done by one of my colleagues that demonstrates that actually 7 government departments have to work together for us to pull off an effective transition that's just. And then the broader integrated plan for the local region and area is important to support the shutdown of coal power stations. We believe that there should be a Mpumalanga integrated development plan to actually address this. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Eskom team. That's obviously a lot of work has been done here and a lot of effort over a lot of time. So yeah, thank you for that sort of overview. I don't want to spend too much time asking questions, although I have many, but I want to kind of hand it over to the audience. So if audience would like to ask questions or to make statements, please do raise a hand. We'll take about 10-15 minutes of questions, and then I'm going to ask Thomas Nguni from Groundworks to give a kind of community perspective of the Komati repurposing process. So please do feel free to raise hands. The Eskom team have been really good at answering questions in the chat as they come up. But perhaps I can kick off with this question from Julia Taylor. Yeah, and I think hinting at the Eskom transition is only part of a broader value chain. And so there are other sort of institutions that are impacted by this transition. The Koenfontein and Bikpan collieries are who Julia mentions most explicitly. How is Eskom working along the value chain? Who are you working with? To kind of also think about how you might transition those workers and what the impact on those workers would be.
So maybe Steve, let me give a response to that. I think a part of these socio-economic impact assessments that we're undertaking is also looking at the whole value chain around the coal-fired power stations. But we're also well aware that the the suppliers of coal to Eskom's power station are well aware of what our dates are for closing down the power station. So it's not something new or surprising to them. They're well aware of the integrated resource plan through the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy that set out the dates for shutting down of these power stations. So our contracts that we do have with the different coal suppliers clearly are based on the operating life of the power station. So it's not like we are going to be terminating any contracts prior to them reaching their life. So they're aware of the contractual supply of coal to the area going forward, and they're aware of what the options are. I think it would be important is also be good to have feedback from the mining sector in terms of their own just energy transition and the plans that they've got in place. But we definitely do bring it into our studies. But the mines are very much aware of what Eskom's plans are and have always been in terms of the contractual arrangements we have. Thanks.
And maybe just a follow-up question, Dave, seeing that there are no hands in the chat just yet. What is your feeling about the sort of general maturity of just transitions in the area? I mean, Eskom's obviously done a lot of work and a lot of thinking, but do you find that the collieries, and not just the collieries, but the other value chain players are thinking about this and doing this a robust level of work? Or do you think it's something that needs to be much more coordinated?
So Steve, maybe if I can just answer from the Komati experience.
Please.
Yeah, so when we started the engagements in 2020, I remember we had an engagement with our own name was some of the mines around the Komati area, the Stifted local municipality. You know, when the conversation to say that Eskom would be shutting down power stations, you know, took some of them by surprise. And one of the things that the responses that we got was that, we need to go back and look into, you know, our own just energy transition plans. Eskom has sort of been at the front of that as well in terms of developing the just energy transition plans. But now this is in 2020, 2021. Now where we are, 2022, the conversation around, you know, the just energy transition, mine closure has sort of like matured, and everyone is coming to the party now, you know, to understand that you need to think about your mine closure, not the, you know, the old way you used to think about, you know, you're going to close the mine and, you know, close the gate of the mine and demolish the structures and leave. The mines are sort of like coming to the party to think about, you know, how do they actually come into the space of transitioning as well. So there's richer conversations now, even with the mines. I know Anglo, I mean, not only have they gotten out of coal, they have a whole, you know, looking into the renewable space as well, going into the renewable energy space. So the conversation has shifted, you know, now mines are getting more hands-on in terms of looking at their own impact and also of closure and the transition. And so there's still a need for coordination though. I was talking to the local municipality. Right now, it's more like, you know, each mine will be coming to present, you know, their closure plan if they are closing, or their social and labor plan if they're still operational. There's the need for that coordination to ensure that actually the projects that are being put in place are coordinated and have value in terms of impact. Because if there's more coordination, you can actually maximize the impact even in terms of the interventions. So I agree in terms of the coordination. Thanks.
Thanks. Any questions from the audience? I don't see any hands just yet. Please feel free to come in. Dan would like to ask a question. Dan, you should be able to speak.
Hi, Steve. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Go ahead.
A question for the PCC. I'm not clear, and maybe due to my own ignorance, what is PCC's role in coordinating the implementation of the national Just Transition Initiative? How do all of these actors feed into what it is you're doing and will be doing from now on. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Good question. I'll give a first go, and if Crispin wants to add anything, he's most welcome. So the PCC work on the just transition is framed by the Just Transition Framework, which we released a month or so ago now and has been approved by Cabinet, which really sets out the principles and the goals for what we want to do nationally in the just transition. Obviously, certain provinces are impacted more than others. We think of Mpumalanga and the Eastern Cape in particular, and perhaps by different economic impacts. The Mpumalanga is obviously closely linked to coal, but also to petrochemicals. Eastern Cape is really closely linked to petrochemicals and the transition to electric vehicles. And both of those provinces also already have huge existing unemployment and poverty and inequality challenges, perhaps more so than other parts of the country. So we do have a slight geographical interest in those areas, but the PCC interest is the overall kind of country objective. So one of the reasons we think the work at Eskom is so important is they're kind of ahead a little bit of many organizations trying to deal with the practicalities. So we want to learn from them, but a key role, following on from Beauty's answer for the PCC, is to start aggregating these players together so that we can learn from each other and move much more quickly than we have been. And so we'll also be looking at working in Mpumalanga to put together the different stakeholders, thinking more about economic diversification beyond power, as well as thinking about how do we more effectively work with communities, give communities information around timelines, processes in local languages, and so that we can be much more procedurally just in how we think about these transitions. But I would be the first to say that we're all still learning, and we're probably going to make mistakes and learn from some of the mistakes that Eskom have made, and hopefully drive this forward a little bit quicker. Crispin, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yes, Steve, and thank you for the question, Dan. Good to see you on this webinar. I mean, maybe the point to clarify is that the Presidential Climate Commission itself is merely an advisory structure. So we obviously are made up of different stakeholders, and we spend a lot of time focusing on the science. We make that available to stakeholders, and then we formulate recommendations. But we don't just make recommendations and leave it. We try and lean in and enable action by the different role players. So we're I guess advisory in a very proactive way. So for instance, on the Just Transition Framework, when we took it to Cabinet, they agreed that there needs to be a detailed implementation plan for how we're going to give effect to that framework. So we're in the process now of starting to work on that implementation plan and talking to each of the stakeholders, not just government, but business, mining companies, civil society organizations, support organizations, academic institutions. So we're starting a process of engaging with each of them to define what are they going to bring to the table, what can they do, what's realistic in terms of timeframes, what resources do they need to do it. So we see our role as, in a sense, enabling implementation as much as just making recommendations on it.
Thanks, Crispin. And thanks for the question, Dan. I am going to hand over at this point to Thomas, who's been waiting patiently to give his perspective from the community point of view, and then we'll take some more discussion after that. So please do be thinking about questions and comments you'd like to make. Thomas, can I invite you to give your input? You're on mute, Thomas. We might have lost Thomas. I think he's going to try and rejoin. I guess in the meantime, just maybe a question to the Eskom team, conscious of the comments that I made around learning from the mistakes, what are some of the bigger challenges that you as the team have faced in facilitating this transition process? And then Thomas, once they've answered that question, I'll bring you in. Thanks.
Sure, that's a big one. I'm going to suggest, Noella, if you want to give a response to that. I think just looking broadly at the Eskom Just Energy Transition Program and some of the challenges.
Sure, Dave. Try to put my camera on. Thanks for the question, Steve. Like Dave said, it's quite a difficult one because we've had quite a few challenges. But one of the challenges that I can think of, the top of my head, are the engagements with labor. We have tried our best to engage at all levels, from the station levels and various platforms as well, having discussions about the just energy transition, trying to communicate our plans as well as the strategy. However, we've had a few challenges with this, and we were unable to engage with our specific labor forums because at these sessions, a lot of the time, the discussions were more about priority issues such as your load shedding or unbundling, and we were not given the opportunity to present the JET strategy. However, things are turning around. I must say that we recently presented at the Generation Forum, where we had NUM, NUMSA, and Solidarity representatives, and were able to share our JET strategy. It was more of a information sharing, getting inputs from the team, and also just making sure that we work together, because we are very cognizant of the fact that we cannot have a just transition without labor being on board with us. This is something that we want to work very well together with labor so we can ensure that it is just, we cater for our employees as well as the community members. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Beauty? Go ahead, Beauty, I can't hear you. Okay, I can't hear Beauty, so I'm going to hand over to Thomas again, and we'll bring Beauty in again after we've heard from Thomas. Thomas, you want to go ahead? You're very faint. Oh no, is it just me, or can anyone else hear Thomas?
No, can't hear Thomas.
Yeah. Thomas, you're very faint. I think there might be something wrong on your mic side. Yeah.
Is it better?
Yeah, that's better. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I think, Steve, what we all need to realize that on a day-to-day basis, we engage with different communities, not only around Mpumalanga, but I would say around South Africa, around the issues of a just transition. I think on several occasions, we've engaged with the Presidential Climate Change Commission. And yes, I'm glad that today we're having this discussion with Eskom. I was hoping that we would also get the World Bank doing some presentation on how they're planning to assist Eskom in this. But having said that, I think we all need to realize that there's a lot that's been said. There's a lot of information that has been shared today. But the biggest trick is, I wish Eskom could prove me wrong, because they keep saying they have consulted. But for one, all of this information they're sharing today is not in the public domain. And we have, on a very consistent basis, mentioned that we cannot engage with something we don't know. Coming into this engagement and seeing certain presentations, PowerPoint presentations for the first time, that does not equal information sharing. We have, I know Eskom has done a social analysis study at Komati, Henrina, and Grootvlei a couple of years back. We have on a very consistent basis that can you share the study? And 3-4 years down the line, that study hasn't been shared as yet. So for me, that's very, very critical to say, how do we engage with the repurposing of Komati if we don't have information in the public domain? And it's quite interesting that when Eskom were doing their own social analysis study, they also mentioned the feeder towns, which is Middleburg, Witbank, and Belfast. But then when you talk about engagement, nothing is being shared. So I think for me, it's quite interesting. And I would also want to know who's leading the process, because in about 2-3 months back, Eskom did a presentation, then the World Bank did a similar presentation, but we couldn't hold either the World Bank or Eskom accountable for the information they were sharing with us. So I think it might be very important for us to get clarity as to exactly who's the lead implementer in this whole thing. And then it would be very interesting for me because I was listening to the response around how the coal supply contracts have been directly tied to the lifespan in terms of the IRP. But I think in terms of the just transition plan, we said we're not going to leave a single person behind, both in terms of decision making, such that it becomes inclusive and ordinary community members and workers can inform overall decision making. But I don't see that happening from where I'm standing. But also it's quite a concern to say people who are working at Blankpan, Goedewop, Warrenfontein mine, which are some of the feeder mines for Komati, the mining houses know very well that their contracts are going to lapse. That means we might be seated with former mine workers who are going to be unemployed, and therefore increasing the number of unemployed people within the specified towns. So in terms of our just transition, I would have liked to see how Eskom is working together with the mine so that the mine workers are also included in the plan to reskill people, to retrain them, so that they could also be in a position to get further opportunities. And I think for me, that's one area which we cannot leave behind, whether the employees were directly employed by Eskom or not. At the end of the day, they're all employees, and we don't want to see the level of unemployment going high. The whole issue about the reskilling, I think we've mentioned it previously. We need a skills map. And right now, we don't have a skills map. We've got Saratech saying we are going to reskill and retrain people. So I don't know where that retraining is going to start and what skills are going to be impacted. But what is important and what we all know is that if we want to create meaningful jobs, the first point of departure is through the manufacturing sector. We know that both jobs in construction and rehabilitation, those are not sustainable jobs because they have a limited time frame. But if we create jobs within the manufacturing sector, then we are creating a value chain which will replicate the coal sector. If we fail to replicate that value chain, then this whole area most definitely will be a ghost town. So it is important for Komati right now. I mean, Komati is quite a nice pilot project. What is the role we are playing in terms of manufacturing? Because initially we know we had 35% local content. Currently, all the IPPs, including Eskom, Komati, we don't hear people talking about local content. If we say we are going to support local SMEs, are we basically saying our local SMEs must go and buy components in Europe, bring them into South Africa to supply Eskom? That doesn't work. That doesn't create jobs. You know, it creates this whole notion that we're promoting a black economic class group, and that hasn't provided any meaningful improvement in our society. We're not talking about one person benefiting, because that's the approach we've seen with the construction of Gisule and Medupi that benefited a few and not the society. Now we need to change this whole thing. We cannot talk about an assembly plant. It's the same thing. Are we going to ship solar panels? Why? Why can't we manufacture our own panels? Then we can build our own mini grids, because there's a clear process in terms of social ownership, local manufacturing, and it all fits into the entire value chain. We are talking in excess of 7 billion in investment just for Komati, for the entire process. That information is not in the public domain. We don't know where it's going to come from. We don't know whether the World Bank is giving us another loan or a concessional grant. I think that information needs to be in the public domain so that people can begin to interact, because at the end of the day, we are the ones who are going to pay. It's either we pay that money through the tariffs or through taxes, but we cannot afford to put South Africa in further debts, because we're already heavily indebted, and it's showing on how the standard of living is decreasing in the country. So I think the whole World Bank loan, it needs to be put in the public domain. People need to interact with it, but people also need to come up with their own ideas to say, if this money is available, this is what we want to see happening. I think Julia Taylor may have mentioned it. This is not just about energy. This is about the whole transition. There are people within the informal sector that will link to the workers that are at Komati, that are linked to the workers in nearby mines. Those people need to be brought in back to the formal economy. How do we work with those people? Some of them provided transport, some of them provided food, some of them provided rooms for laundry. How do we bring those people on board? And in terms of the entire plan, not even a single word is being said. It's only, we will help communities develop SMEs. It's not enough. We should go beyond that. So for me, I think what Eskom needs to do is to organize a face-to-face meeting, get community people on board, get all the stakeholders on board, have a visit around Komati, let them explain the entire process, sit down with community people and say, we have this plan, do we have any input? So that if we need to make amendments and say, this plan is not going to work for the people of this region, this plan is not going to work, we should be given that space to say, these are things that we need to think about. The whole issue about aquaponics, I think we need to be very realistic. We cannot think about commercial agriculture at this point in time. We need to think about how best do we provide people with land, not just industry, how do we provide people with land such that they can grow their own food, and then we can develop a redistributive chain locally such that we could make sure that people have access to basic needs, to a basic staple at a very affordable rate. So currently, if people are talking about aquaponics, for me, it's like we're still talking about huge investments, which will still leave a lot of people out of the mainstream agricultural economy. So I think we need to rethink how we want to redo agriculture and support agriculture that will be led and owned by local people. And I would want to support the idea of a JT hub, but I want to be very specific. If we're going to have a Just Transition Center, I would call around Eskom that out of the finances they're talking about, let them support community organizations to run and control the Just Transition Hub. These are the people who are going to be responsible to disseminate information. These are the people who are going to coordinate issues around the JT, not just only Eskom, but the entire JT process. So I think for me, it's very important that we look into some of these funds and say, how then do we work with community-based organizations such that whatever development happens, we know that it will be representative of the community's interest. Lastly, I would want to specifically engage. I think we need to develop clear principles of engagement. One, we need to share information with people in time. Secondly, we need to make sure that when we share information, it is in a language that people can understand and interact with. Thirdly, I think we need to revisit this whole thing about stakeholders. Who are these stakeholders? Because when I look into the Eskom documents, you consult with business, you consult probably one or two councillors within the municipality, and then you come back and claim we have done proper consultation. And I don't think one councillor or the business sector, because it's organized, is representative of what we call a community. I might be talking right now. I do not claim to represent people. As much as I engage with them, I always say, and this is always what I say, even with the commission, I can facilitate that people are in a meeting, they are in the correct space so that they can interact with the processes. Not that I will come into a meeting and claim to represent people. So I think this whole notion of we've consulted with the councillor and therefore it means we've done consultation. It doesn't work with me. I think there are a lot of community people who are out there. Again, as much as Noella, you were saying you've consulted with labor, I can rightfully say right now that labor does not have this information you are sharing on the Eskom repurposing. In August, we were planning to protest around Komati because you guys are not sharing information. I don't know who you're sharing this information with, but there was a planned protest, which will be a collective between labor and community people to say, let alone the plans, forget the plans, share the information you have with us. And I don't see any reason why the first social analysis study that was done at Komati and Henrina was not shared with us, but now we're talking about another study in the same areas. I don't know what we're aiming to achieve. I don't know what is that we're hiding, but we also need to remember, Eskom is a public entity. It's a state-owned entity, and it's the only industry producing electricity in South Africa. There's no competition, there's no what. So this whole notion about information is confidential. I don't know, confidential for who? So that information needs to be put in the public domain. And within the PCC, we have mentioned, and I urge Eskom to do that as of tomorrow. Take that information, put it in public libraries, put it in public clinics. Ordinary people can go there and have that information. Then when we hold our face-to-face meeting, we can begin to engage with that. So Steve, one of the things I want us to come out with here is, when is the next meeting which will be held at Komati so that community people can begin to engage with the plans, and how soon? And if I had my way, I would say Eskom needs to start sharing all the information they have around Komati tomorrow, so that when we go to a face-to-face meeting, people can have enough information to engage with the process. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Always a considered response, which we really appreciate. I mean, lots of really interesting things there. And I guess one of the challenges it brings up is, where are the boundaries for different organizations? So I do sympathize a little bit with Eskom. You know, to what degree do they need to get involved in the value chains and in the localization processes, you know, that are kind of outside their boundaries, but critical to the transition of their organization and their workers as well. And I guess this key question around, you know, when is engagement enough? How many engagement channels do we need to have? But it is clear and important that communities and workers feel adequately communicated with. I wonder if Blessing wants to just quickly, Blessing Manale is the head of comms from the PCC side, whether you can just mention a little bit about some of the work that the PCC is doing to help communicate some of this work. And obviously we hope that this session will now be available online, and people will be able to engage with it more. More is needed, but we think maybe this is a good start. Blessing, maybe just a couple of sentences on some of the engagement work that we're doing.
Well, thanks, and good afternoon, colleagues. I think it's been a very empowering engagement. Let me just say that as the PCC communications, we've started talking quite a lot recently with the communications team at Eskom, as well as the regulatory affairs team there, because we had really thought that we should expand it to beyond Komati. So the idea that we must start watching all other power stations in the pipeline falls within that communications and outreach plan. And I think that we should find a way of empowering communities. And as Thomas had said, use community radio stations. The idea of a communications hub would work, but we don't just want to build structures and buildings for community engagement, but we think that we need to find ways of of keeping communities engaged there. And lastly, the work with the province, particularly around the green agency cluster and capacity in the province, because there is challenges around whether the province communicates this back to communities through their imbus and all that. So you might be meeting the Steve Chu at a municipality, but when the mayor goes to an imbus, he speaks about potholes and not speaks about Komati. So we'll have to find this coordination would also be at a communication level, and as well as we are toying with the idea of an implementation forum, as well as a template for what an implementation plan would look like. And that might be used to guide some of the low-hanging fruits that are not at the core of the plant operations, but around socio-economic intervention. So I think we look forward to working with the team at Eskom and with Groundworks and other local NGOs to sustain the momentum of compacting back together around finding solutions there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Blessing. And there are two questions from the audience, so we'll take those two questions quickly, and then I'd like to give the last word to the Eskom team. So I'm going to ask BK to please share your thoughts, and then followed by Stefan. BK, go ahead.
Good day, everybody. Okay, great. My name is BK from a company called Pineal Impact. I just want to commend Eskom for the idea of microgrid assembly. I think it's a brilliant idea that will, obviously, starting off with Komati Port, we might not see the results immediately, but I think it's a seed that when, over time will, create some interesting approaches to how, the just energy transition can be diversified to not only focus on employment creation, but also entrepreneurship, as well as women empowerment. So I think it's really a great idea. But what I would love to know is whether it would create an opportunity to connect those microgrids onto the main grid, considering the richness of the grid network in the province, and whether there are opportunities to create, to even connect those microgrids to battery energy storage systems, which would eventually, create an opportunity down the line for arbitration within the energy market. I mean, there's early stage ideas, but these could lay a very interesting seed for a distributed energy network that is truly distributed, that is owned by the communities, and that is creating a much broader and diversified just energy transition definition and ideation. So, big up to Eskom on that one. Thank you.
Thanks, BK. Stefan? Stefan, I think you're still on mute. Okay, it seems we can't hear from Stefan. Sorry, Stefan, we can't hear you. Okay, so then I'm going to hand over to the Eskom team, maybe just to respond briefly to some of those questions and to Thomas's input. But really, maybe I think, Thomas, the point you make is we need more engagements. We think an engagement at Komati with the communities would be an excellent way forward. It's not something we can give exact dates on now, but it's certainly something we can commit to trying to organize with the Eskom team. And clearly we need more discussion on this, particularly at a local level. So from the PCC side, we are keen to facilitate these. This is really just the beginning of a longer set of conversations. But Noella, maybe I can hand over to you to conclude for the Eskom, or introduce the conclusion from the Eskom team.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you for all the comments, the compliments, as well as the criticism. We are very aware that some of the information has not been shared publicly, and it is something that we are working on, specifically the socio-economic impact assessment reports. This is something that we need to finalize. There's a certain aspect of it that needed to be finalized, specifically the implementation aspects, so that we can clarify the role that Eskom will play in implementing some of these proposals, and the role that the South African social partners would also play. So those are just some of the aspects that we need to clarify before we put out the document publicly. But this is something we're working on that should be done by the end of this year. Beauty can speak on this, but this is something we are addressing. With regards to the World Bank financial, the amount that needs to be put out publicly, the documents and the agreement has not been finalized. So this is something that is still a work in progress. As soon as all the documents have been signed, this is something that we are aware that we need to communicate, and it will be communicated. But with regards to the funding, we are looking at all different avenues to get funding for the projects for Komati Power Station. This includes concessional funding, grant funding. We're also engaging with a lot of the DFIs to source out funding to assist us to implement the projects. But this is something that we're aware that needs to also be communicated. Sorry, did someone say something? Was it you, Steve?
Yes, it was.
I don't know if I'm allowed
in the background.
Okay, sure, Thomas. Let me see if I can just address the other questions, and then my colleagues can come in as well. And then with regards to the skilling, you mentioned the skilling with Saratech. So because we have partnered with Saratech, we are focusing on the skills that they specialize in, and these are the solar as well as wind, and we are trying to implement or integrate skills for microgrids as well, agrivoltaics, etc. And this is still being finalized. We have rolled out the first training at Komati, and this was focused on the employees, and it was focused on just the general understanding and introduction to renewable energy. So we are doing something. The other detailed projects and the skills mapping, etc., is still something that still needs to be done, and we are aware of that. Thanks.
Thomas, did you want to make your point quickly, and then Beauty can come in?
I'll try and be short, Steve. Look, we need to realize that we can just do a transition, and an honest one, without relying on the World Bank or the IMF funding. I think sometimes when we speak about funding, we need to look into our own coffers. What do we have and where can we raise money? Because it seems we are dependent a lot on debt financing, which puts the country in another difficult position. And I don't think both politically and economically, we want to be controlled by the World Bank or the IMF or Europe. So when we talk about funding, we should always go back to our own funds. We've got the IDC, we've got the Development Bank of South Africa. They all have funds. What kind of funds are we using locally so that we can stop this dependence on European funding?
Yeah, thank you. Beauty, do you want to?
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, and I see we're over time. But thank you so much, Thomas, and for your submission earlier. And the other gentleman, yeah, you've raised quite important issues in terms of the skills mapping and then the manufacturing. Look, in terms of the manufacturing, it is in the proposal. Then it's one of the things that has been looked at quite extensively also by the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan, just to say how can we create opportunities, because actually manufacturing would be more would create more local opportunities, but you have to look at, the demand, and not only look at the demand, you also have to look at the pipeline in terms of for how long. So those are some of the issues that the industry has to look at in terms of the manufacturing, but it's certainly something that is being looked at both nationally and also at Eskom as well. Your comment about the World Bank and the Eskom presentations being the same. So what has happened is that we have been engaging with the World Bank since last year in terms of, the funding. So, the Komati project. So I did share slides on the impact assessment, but I ended up sharing some of the slides on the Komati project, which is the project jointly by the World Bank and Eskom. That is why those slides are similar. On the website, through you, Chair, I have put links, one to Eskom website, Just Energy Transition website, where you can get further information. And I've also put the World Bank website link where you can get information specifically on the Komati project. You've raised a lot of issues and concerns about the informal sector. It's an important sector that needs to be factored in terms of the transition. You've also raised comments about the information sharing. I think Noella has addressed the studies, though they started in 2020, they have not been completed. That is why they are not in the public domain. But I think what is good is that we are going through the last phase, what is called the outcomes consultation, where the Komati report will be shared and we can get a comment from the public. So maybe through you, Steve, and your team, we can actually make sure that when we do the outcomes consultation, the document is shared through your website as well, so that we can get comments from everyone. We will be having a last phase in terms of the outcomes consultations for Komati. I think looking at the time, I will leave it there, Chair. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I want to thank everybody for staying with us and apologize for running over time a little bit, but I think that was a fascinating conversation. I think there's a lot that we can learn from the process that Eskom has run. This is a similar kind of process needs to be run in every institution that's involved in the transition. So there's a lot of things that we can learn both now and into the future. As I said, the beginning of the conversation, we hope to have more of this, particularly as we drill down into the details. This was very much an introductory session. So I think we'll wrap here and commit to having further conversations further down the line. Thank you very much to the Eskom team for availing yourself, and thank you very much, Thomas, for your comments. We will certainly work on setting up that community Komati location-based event. And yes, please do feel free to keep engaging with us. Feel free to send us questions and comments via email. And then just as a final note, please be reminded that we're hosting a parallel session on Thursday this week, looking at coal closure scenarios as part of our sort of long-term energy dialogue process. So with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you very much, everyone. Again, I really appreciate the input and the conversation. And